been running a few minutes, and you can see it's reading about 200 degrees on the gauge. It just sailed right past 180, and it's still climbing. Yet, if I go to my thermometer up here at the surge tank, it's not even reading 100 degrees. The water's barely warm, so the thermostat hasn't even opened yet. And that's a new thermostat in there. So I'm going to give it time to let that thermostat actually open, get water flowing, and get the temp up to 170, and we're going to look at the gauge again. Thermostat is starting to open. I'm at about 150 degrees at the surge tank, and in here it's still reading 200, 220. So we're going to let this stabilize. This usually stabilizes around 175. So we will see, but it's running very smooth. No problem here. Let's take a look at airflow. One simple thing I like to do is just take a piece of paper, just put it up. That's how good that airflow is through the grill. And we'll go up in here, and it's just sucked right up against that radiator. So the fan is drawing air through the radiator very well. Let's try that with the, well, I can't do it with the hood down because I got my thermometer in here, but we'll try it again with the hood down. So it's coming up on 175 here, and the temp's coming up slow. And yet this is still reading like 220. So I'm thinking the gauge is wrong. Now with the hood down and latched, let's check the airflow just in case it's an air exhaust problem. Once again, that paper just flops right up there, and that's the grill. I go through here and into the radiator. Come on, baby. There we go. Same thing. So it's got good airflow across the radiator, even with the hood down and latched. And that's about as high as I can get that thermometer to run. 175. It's sitting there nice and stable. I got flow through the radiator. And yet the gauge is reading 240. So, not sure. The best I can think of is the gauge, either the signal's bad, the sending unit's bad, or the gauge is bad. So I've been driving the car, and it seems to be running good, but the temperature gauge is pegged. It's reading over 240 right now. And that doesn't make sense because I don't have any steam. There's no evidence of it overheating. It's running fine, but with power on, it's clearly reading 240 degrees. So if I go out here and I put an ohmmeter on the sending unit, I'm getting around, what is that, 77 ohms. Let's see where that stabilizes. 78 ohms right in there. We'll let that go a little bit. And when I put a thermometer in the top tank, I'm getting about 175. This mark right there is, oh crap, 175. So I should be around, and I got 180 degree thermostat in this. So 79 ohms. If it were fully hot, it should be reading about 33 ohms. So I think I've either got a bad gauge. The sending unit seems to be close. I think 79 ohms is probably going to put me around 190 degrees. And with this reading, let's see if we can get a good read on that here on the thing. Okay, right now it's not even reading 150. When I get the engine running, it typically comes right up to about 175. So rear of the engine, what am I about? Getting close to 90 or 80 ohms, 79, 80 ohms. So I think the problem is something to do with the gauge or the power feed to the gauge. I think my sending unit's correct. I've never seen anything in the top tank more than 175 measured with a candy thermometer. And I've used that thing many, many times on other projects. So there we go, 80, 79, 80 ohms. So I'm gonna have to take a look at the gauge and see what's going on there. But I think functionally, I don't have a temperature problem. Well, I've not been able to successfully get this to read other than full hot when the engine's running, regardless of what the resistance is on the sending unit. So I have played contortionist and have been under the dash, have disconnected the wires and pulled the two attaching fasteners out. So I can now, I may have to push it from the back side. I'm going to set the phone down. So many of these jobs are two-handed. So I've pulled the wires off the back side, pulled the attaching screws out, and now I can remove the water temp gauge from the dash. And one problem I've got is that the gauge in the housing is loose. So I'm going to snug that up. As I'm pulling things apart, I can feel it loose in the back. So I'm going to tighten that up. There. So now this is now tight. Hopefully that'll help. What I'm suspecting is that this is where the signal comes into the gauge, and that this may have been grounding to the housing. So I've grabbed a Hawk gauge. This is a fuel gauge, but it actually operates the same as a water temp gauge. It's a 33 to 240 ohm full range gauge. So I can actually plug that in and just see what that does for reading. I would expect it if it's running 100 ohms, I'd be about halfway. So I'm going to throw this gauge in and just try it and see if I get a normal reading. So that's our next step. So I've installed this gauge where the water temp gauge was and hooked it up just like the water temp gauge. And now we're going to fire up the car and let it warm up and see if this reads a little over halfway. Again, just because that's a fuel gauge, it is the same innards as a water temp gauge. So we'll fire it up and see how far that goes. Hopefully it doesn't peg, and then we'll know the difference is the two gauges. And if that's the case, then we'll have to figure out how to maybe put these innards into that water temp gauge. So we're going to start the car, warm it up, see what happens. Okay, here's a neat trick. I've disconnected the temp sender from the wire, pulled that wire off, so the gauge is completely disconnected from the sending unit. Let's see what happens when we put some power to it. I'm just going to turn this on. I'm not powering up the car. I'm just going to turn this on. Huh. The gauge is moving. So there must be another ground that's causing it to move, because right now, look at that, it's moving. I'm turning it off, but it's completely disconnected from the sending unit. So we're going to have to check the ground to the gauge. Now I've disconnected the signal line from the sending unit to the gauge, and I've disconnected the ground. And there it goes. So it is getting ground somewhere. The only thing hooked up to this thing is the positive 12 volts from the ignition switch. Nothing else. The ground of that is disconnected, and this is a fiberglass dash. So somewhere it's getting ground. I'm wondering if it's backfeeding through the lights, because there is a gauge light attached to the box that this is attached to. Here's what it looks like in the dash. This temp gauge goes through the face of the dash, and it bolts in on the back side to a box like this. And it's got two posts that attach it, and this one goes to ground. This one gets 12 volts from the ignition switch, and this one gets the resistance from the sending unit. Right now, I have everything disconnected except the 12 volts, and it's powering the gauge. There's no ground attached to this. I'm wondering, there's a light that goes in here. The ground is supposed to ground this box to turn the light on. But I'm wondering if somehow that light is backfeeding and providing ground to this. Like if this insulator is not good, if it's somehow grounding this post and we're getting a read when we shouldn't get anything. So I think we may wind up pulling the other gauge off and pulling this box out and see what it looks like. Well, I know this is going to seem kind of silly, but no matter what I do, if I disconnect the signal lines to this gauge, somehow it's getting a ground with 12 volts to it, and it starts reading even though there's no water temp. And it's supposed to be insulated by the box that it's attached to. It's supposed to have these insulators here. And for some reason the box, even though I take the ground off of it, it still is grounded. And as I said, it might be this light bulb that goes here grounding it out. It could be the ammeter grounding it out. But for some reason, it's completing the circuit when it shouldn't. So I've taken some electrical tape and I've ground the signal and the power line. And we're going to put that in the dash and see if, when we hook up the power, nothing reads. It shouldn't until we hook, if we have the 12 volts to it, it shouldn't read anything until we put the signal on. So we're going to try that. Hopefully this helps. Let's see. Okay, we've insulated the back of the gauge, hooked up power, hooked up the signal, and hooked up ground. Ground is just for the light bulb. So we've now turned the ignition switch on. We've got the battery hooked up, and it's not moving, which is good. So now let's try, hopefully, is it moving or not? Moved a little bit, but let's start the car up and let it warm up and see what happens. Okay, let's see how we're doing. We've got a smooth idle. We have no leaks at the accelerator pump, no leaks at the carburetor body. Temperature is coming up slowly. The temp gauge is reading about 140, 145. So it has not gone up in peg for the first time. So let's let that sit for a minute, see if we get the full temp, and see if that holds steady around 180, 185. Looks like the thermostat's just opening. It's been running for a while now. And it looks like we're about 165 at the tank, thereabouts. Normally it'd be reading about 240 right now, and it is reading right around 180, just a tick over 180. Normally it's pegged by now. So I think we may have made a good change to this. I'd like to take it out for a long drive. Unfortunately, we've had some of that white stuff come down, but that's supposed to be gone in a day or so. So right now, I think we're looking good. So let's keep running it, see what happens.